May I now come to the diversity issue, which Nick has mentioned in his presentation. This is one of the issues which is affected not only this country, but India and many other countries around the world. What used to happen was people used to accept what used to be any kind of discrimination, but people are no longer prepared to accept any kind of discrimination. So I'm very pleased to invite Samira Ahmed, my colleague at the BBC. She's one of our veteran presenters. She has been, I've worked with her on World News TV, but she has been one of our main presenters. You see her Newswatch program on BBC. Samira, please.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here and lovely to see Nick and everyone again. This September, it'll be 30 years since I began my career in journalism at the BBC, and I was a news trainee. So what I thought I'd do is I'll talk a little bit about my career structure and then open it out into the lessons that I think I've learnt about how we're covering news and how far we're representing everything the way that we should. So a bit of practical stuff. My parents came from India and Pakistan in the early 60s. My mother worked for Bush House. She worked in the Eastern section for many years, including doing a lot of drama. And she also presented some of the Asian language programming out of Pebble Mill, Nia Zindagi Nia Jeevan and Karba. And she's an actress as well, so she kind of straddled the two. And weirdly, I never thought of her as a journalist. I thought of her primarily as a kind of actress. So although I spent a lot of time in Bush House with her, it wasn't the networking that got me in, let's just say. But what was hugely valuable from a very young age was this dual sense of the power of the BBC as a global broadcaster, the expertise in Bush House of all these international journalists. And I'm so grateful to people like Kailash Badwar, who headed the Eastern section, for just understanding the importance of the international journalists to the reputation of the BBC. And so that was one side of it. And then the other side was as someone growing up very much born and raised in Britain and feeling that, my British identity was ultimately my prime one. It was quite interesting working out where the balances were on what was reasonable and fair coverage. So I joined the BBC in 1990 as a graduate news trainee on their kind of fast-track news journalism programme. And it was amazing, the most incredible access, the most incredible teaching. We went on to work on, I worked on Newsnight as a reporter, I worked on the Today programme as a reporter, I got my first job as a graduate news trainee, as a network news reporter for radio bulletins. And while a trainee, I worked in Belfast in the newsroom there, which of course was at the height of the Troubles. So I felt very, very well trained and equipped. Very much the best training there was in journalism and in broadcasting in particular. And the early 90s was the time where I think the BBC's reputation was particularly strong and confident. And it was starting to face some of those challenges like the breakup of Yugoslavia, these terrible genocidal situations unravelling, actually not that far away from London. It wasn't the other side of the world. And there were real issues there about the ethics of how we covered these stories. I left the BBC after 7 years in total. And I should say during that time, I was also a Los Angeles correspondent. So I covered the O.J. Simpson case, the second civil trial that he lost. And I was quite interested in how people talked only about the racial element and the celebrity element, but actually at the heart of it, it was a domestic violence murder. And as a British journalist, and I guess as a female journalist, I was reporting it the way we would in Britain, where you focus on what's being said in court. And the American journalists were quite fascinated, and they used to come and listen to me filing, because I'd be focusing on, the fairness and balance when you're covering court proceedings, as if I was in the UK, whereas in America there's much less control or regulation about how you cover cases. And it was very important to me to focus on the reality of the crime and not be distracted by the celebrity. But I left the BBC at the end of 1997, and I went to work for Deutsche Welle TV in Berlin for a year, partly because it was a really interesting year in Germany, and I very much wanted to be working there. So although I was mainly a news presenter, although I speak German, I was delivering it in English. It was also fascinating to find myself, in a sense, a foreign language service. So it was like being in the language service in Bush House. English, Spanish, were the main foreign language services that were done for Deutsche Welle, and it was a kind of a big expansion into TV world news, competing with BBC and CNN. So I found that fascinating as well. And also seeing the prejudices and the limitations. I mean, Germans at the time still talked about sub-Saharan Africa as Schwarz Africa. And I think it was really interesting when I was trying to have conversations about this language being insensitive and them saying, well, we don't have a colonial problem like Britain does. And actually it turns out they do. I mean, there's a lot that's emerged about Western Africa, and they pioneered genocide and concentration camps there too, like the British. That's part of what you learn when you work in international newsrooms. I also worked at World Service Television, and that was both in the early 90s, and then I came back in 98 when I worked across World Service and sort of BBC World Television and what was then News 24. So a sense again of the global and the domestic news channel. And one of the really interesting things in recent years has been how partly in response to what Nick was talking about, this pressure to make news appealing to audiences who are being kind of turning away from it, is to make everything very, very, very domestic and focus on local stories at the expense of international coverage and understanding major events that are unfolding elsewhere. And I think perhaps we could take some of this in questions. My concern, as someone who I went to work at Channel 4 News from 2000 to 2011. And during that time, I did a story for them. And because the great thing about Channel 4 News was it being nearly an hour, you could do long films. And I was approached by ActionAid, the charity, in 2009. And they said, we've got a story that we think might work really well for International Women's Day. And it was about how lesbian women were being targeted for rape and murder. There's a huge rape issue in South Africa. It's got one of the highest rape crises in the world. And this was, in 2009, 1 in 4 women by the age of 16 has been raped, which I think is astounding. And I said, why would you do it just for International Women's Day? It's a story in its own right. And this is one of my big things, is I hate the way that International Women's Day, many broadcasters and news organisations use it as a place to sort of dump all those stories as if the rest of the year, we get back to the real business of stuff when women aren't actually supposed to be 50% of the population. So I really am wary of how it's been used. And you get 100 women and you get all these things and you put all these women together, whereas I think the 50-50 programme the BBC is doing is much more. And I would argue that women have been quietly pushing 50-50 for years without it being labelled an official programme, but been just trying to normalise proper representation of gender, sorry, I should say of sex, and of racial diversity and sexual diversity for years. And that should be our focus, not putting special categories around things. But that film I did was really interesting because it didn't run as an International Women's Day thing. We ran it straight away and it ran as a news story. And I won the Stonewall Broadcaster of the Year award, which I'm really proud of because the focus was on an issue that had been going on for years. And part of, again, what's interesting about journalism is they were finding it difficult, the women in South Africa, and it was feminist organisations of white and black women, although most of the victims were black women. They weren't getting local coverage. And there was this sense that, well, it's only poor women from townships, so, and there's lots of rape in this country, so why should we pick up these stories? And so the moment an international broadcaster turns up and starts filming the protests, they had sit-down protests in the courtroom in Johannesburg. I talked to the family of one of the victims she was going to be the first female referee at the Men's Football World Cup, which was being held in South Africa. So, there were some really moving aspects to this story. And when I covered it, CNN, the BBC, everyone picked it up and they all covered the subsequent trial of the attackers of Yudi Similani, who was the woman whose case I focused on. I'm not saying I changed anything long term, but I'm struck by the importance, and we talk about people being cynical about journalism, when journalists raise attention for important stories about ordinary people who don't have power and don't have access to power, then we are doing a service and it gets valued. And I think that I'm not saying we can do it all the time, but so much of the news that's being underreported is how ordinary people are being mistreated, whether that's the reality of universal benefits and the suicides that have been happening in this country, or we know some of the individual stories that are emerging from India, from Delhi, where these terrible murders have been taking place. I think the most important thing journalists can do is focus on telling the stories of the powerless and the ordinary to show that we're on the side of our democracy and of ordinary people. So I left Channel 4 News in 2011 and I went freelance. So I now present a combination of arts programmes on radio, including Front Row, which is the Radio 4 flagship arts programme, where we often cover arts in their relation to news. George Osborne, then Chancellor, invited me to Downing Street to talk about why he was taking this big cultural mission to China, and how having Shakespeare performed in China would kind of be a kind of quid pro quo in terms of getting advances. And of course, when it comes to human rights abuses, people are very cynical about how giving them treasures from the British Museum and touring our Shakespeare is really making a difference, or it's actually making them feel we can get all this stuff anyway. So arts is very much part of news. I do a show called Newswatch, which is where British viewers express their comments and concerns about news coverage. And it's fascinating because it's not in any way a scientific focus group. It's a self-selected audience. And although I go into schools a lot and I talk to young people, we always find that even if lots of people complain, the people who'll be willing to come on and appear on the programme will be filmed overwhelmingly male rather than female, and overwhelmingly older and white rather than any other group. And this is a huge issue. It doesn't mean that we should ignore those complaints, but there's something about people who feel entitled to complain and to be heard, and the challenge in how you then report what are the issues. So some of the concerns about the BBC was accused of being too pro-Remain. What's interesting is it also gets accused a lot of being too pro-Leave in terms of coverage, giving too much voice to people like Lawrence Fox, the actor who expressed quite controversial views about how white people were being discriminated against and racism doesn't really exist. And I just think broadcasters have to be really careful and hold their nerve to some extent, because if we just respond to who's shouting the loudest, then we're not representing. Again, it comes back to who we're not hearing from and why. We know that women routinely get talked over, we know that younger people routinely get talked over, and we know that people from minority backgrounds can feel intimidated, and we know that people from less affluent class backgrounds often feel intimidated. So that's why it isn't good enough to sort of say we have to respond to all these complaints, a lot of which are orchestrated by the BBC's media enemies. Just think of everything to finish off. So just a couple of other thoughts. I know that the story that we've got going at the moment, I've had a lot of issues about the coverage of the riots in India and people complaining. Kinnan Malik wrote a piece in The Observer saying he was worried about the use of the word communal violence. This is this old term that's wheeled out as if it's all going back to, partition or something, and that this is fundamentally different because the situation as it was unfolding was very much, it seemed to be political mobs who were going into places like the JN University and were attacking students. And it wasn't about Muslims and Hindus turning on each other. So I'm quite interested in any thoughts about how far there's been a lack of consideration and we're careless about using those terms. There's also been a real noticeable number of errors. Even though they're few, they really jump out. So some are non-racial, like Boris Johnson's footage of him laying the wreath at the cenotaph, and they used different footage where he looked less dishevelled, and people saw a conspiracy in that to make him look better. But a more controversial one was when Shashi Kapoor died, and the BBC News at 10 ran a very short item, but they didn't even manage to use a clip where they clearly identified him. They used a clip of a film he'd been in which there were at least 2 actors, and it was obvious that no one had thought to just go to a different floor and ask anyone from the Eastern section if they could just help identify if they didn't know. And I think there's so many journalists of different backgrounds who work in the BBC. I'm all the more shocked that errors like that happen, and they are ultimately about not really caring enough to make sure you double checked. I know there's issues about pressure, but there's a big fuss kicked up about that. And separately, of course, there was the whole treatment of Naga Munchetty in the complaint about alleged bias when she responded to very, very persistent questioning by her male co-presenter about Trump's tweets about go back home, and the original complaint mentioned both presenters, and yet miraculously by the time it got escalated to the most serious level, his name was completely left out and she was censured, and then the judgment was overturned. I think again it shows the importance of having I hate the word robust, but you need to think who's making the decisions, and on what basis are they making them. And I think so much of it is the failure to have leadership figures of diverse backgrounds. When I think of how many senior journalists I've known who've got to a certain level at the BBC and then have chosen to leave. And I think that's the biggest problem in many broadcast organisations, is they're not in leadership. You can have all the mentoring you like, you can have all the entry programmes you like, but where are they 20 years later? Right, ready to take questions with Nick? Oh, I had one other thing I was going to mention, which I forgot, which was, one of the things about Brexit in this country that I think is quite relevant to how we think about diversity is it's always struck me, and I've often spoken about it, how little coverage we've had in Britain for years of how the EU actually works. And then there we were having this major vote about our future in it. And I think 30 years ago there was more coverage of, maybe not of the minutiae of EU politics, but of certainly of what was going on in other European nations. It's not just about not covering India or Africa properly. I just think there's this focus on the domestic and a failure to cover important things that people needed to know. Like, what does the European Parliament do? What does the EU Commission do? What kind of policies were they pushing through on a week-to-week basis? And that was just not apparent in British news.
Thank you, Samira. It's been fascinating, especially about your journey as a journalist, BME journalist, and it's been really educational for many people, and she has been an inspiration within the BBC and outside the BBC among young journalists. So, any questions people would like to ask to, David?
Yeah, hi. Just combining two questions really, because Nick, your assessment on television is unique, both across the world and in the younger age group. So maybe just thinking about something to the effect of public service television in educating people about things they should know about. If you take the coronavirus at the moment, can you give some idea of where public service TV sits in this, and as much as the information that should be getting out that isn't getting out, and whether actually this is a very long slippery road we're going down, where actually things that a population should know. And I remember a very while back when the Sarajevo fiasco was on, I remember one of the senior BBC executives saying we needed to have explainers beforehand, so almost every day, because just people who approached it and didn't know. How is that really affecting the level of journalism at the moment?
Can I give the BBC thing, and then you can give a bigger picture? I mean, we're going to be discussing coronavirus coverage on Newswatch, which we're recording on Friday. I've really noticed over the last week, I think the BBC has been absolutely exemplary in emphasising how many more people die of flu every year in this country, which is tens of thousands, compared to coronavirus. And it's actually very much the newspapers, I think, in this country and online, which have been stirring things up. And I think, people often say in America, you trust the newspapers and not television news. I think in Britain it's the other way around. I think, we tend to trust our broadcasters. And the ITV and certainly the BBC, I can speak of with knowledge, I think have really been very, very, very careful to keep it focused and practical. But I think the papers, and I looked at the headlines yesterday, they're stirring up worst case scenarios, I think, and fueling panic.
Yeah, I agree. I think the coverage has been great, and I think it's so interesting that this crisis has come just after all of those questions about public service broadcasting, and the need for careful, considered, balanced coverage where it's not sensationalized because you have to sell newspapers. But to do that, you have to have people who are coming to you all the time. There's no point in doing it if you're like PSB in the US, where very few people are watching it. They're producing great stuff. So it is this incredibly difficult balance in this fragmented, hyper-competitive world of how does the BBC remain relevant. I mean, on the positive side, I should be clear that the BBC is in the UK one of the most successful public service broadcasters in the world at reaching people across radio, television and online. So around 75% of people are, according to our data, are accessing it every week. That's more than pretty much any other public service broadcaster in the world, including some of the most successful in the Nordic countries, which have huge reach. But you only have to look at the States to see the dangers and the alternative, which many people advocate for, of course, but it's, you see in our data we've seen an increase in people who prefer partial news, prefer news from their own point of view over the last 3 or 4 years in the US. There is no strong public service broadcaster that gets large audiences, and you have this incredibly polarized world. It is the most polarized country in the world. They do not share facts. I mean, they literally live in these different bubbles where you've got Fox and right-wing sites on the one hand and talk radio, and on the other side you've got the liberal media, MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post. And if you look at the audiences for those, they are, 80% are made up of people like them. They're made up of liberals who read the New York Times and conservatives who read Fox, and there is no sort of shared sense of facts. Now, I think when you come to something like coronavirus, that's really quite dangerous if everyone's got alternative facts on a matter of life and death. So I think we really need to hold on to, we don't know until we lose it how good how good it was, and the problem is that you've got the government undermining it, you've got rival commercial publishers undermining it for their own commercial purposes, partly ideological, partly their own commercial purposes, and there's nobody who can stand up for the BBC because it's very hard to stand up for yourself. Yeah, so it's tricky.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Suresh Gupta, the future of print media and pay media. I see every day people are refusing to take evening standard at tube stations when people are giving them free. And then at night, the streets are littered with destroyed copies of evening news, evening standard. And similarly, print media seems to be going down and down. And what do you think is the future of this print media and pay media ultimately?
I have some thoughts because I still work across all those media, and I had a Scott Trust bursary when I was at City University, so I worked for The Guardian and I still write for them. I'm always struck by the sheer destructiveness of that moment, and it was a London Papers thing, when you had two free rival London papers, and the Evening Standard was forced to go free, and it used to be you paid 30 pence for it, and there's something about the mistake of going to a free model, whether it was online or a giveaway, which has been problematic. Although Metro, I think, is hugely successful, and it's one of my main sources of news. I think long term there's a big issue, and I think what's interesting is like the Telegraph. I was reading Roy Greenslade about it, which was very much pro the Boris Johnson paper. He was their star columnist. They're in free fall, despite the fact that they're most closely allied with the government in power. So I'm interested in what you think.
A number of things. One, I was thinking when I was seeing the litter of the Standard on the tubes, I just never thought about it before, but I did literally this week, and actually it's actually quite a bad thing that we're chopping down rainforests when people have access to all these digital things. So I think it's not all bad that print is going down. I think that my sense is that many of these, well, firstly, the press has been incredibly important and powerful in this country and has shaped the agenda. And that has been done through newspapers and through delivering those to people's homes and people picking them up, and this daily habit that people have had. And we go back to the EU, a lot of our attitudes around the EU have been forged by misrepresentative coverage from the likes of Boris Johnson over many, many years. So there's Brussels correspondents writing articles about bent bananas that has shaped people's views, drip, 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 and the press has played a huge part in that. Now, the press is less powerful in the UK than it used to be because they have been slower to push into digital. They were slower to push into digital, and so the numbers and the reach has gone down. Now, there are some exceptions, like The Guardian, but almost all of them now have committed to digital. So it used to be that online was a little offshoot, a few low-paid people in the corner doing the online. It's completely reversed now. Digital is the heart of the Telegraph strategy. It's a different strategy. It's subscription. It's about building loyal audiences for politics and a whole load of other niches. So that the strategies, the Times now moving into radio, for example. Yeah,
I remain cynical about how well that's going to do.
Yeah.
I remember the Channel 4 was launching Rivals Radio 4 15 years ago. That never got off the ground. I'm not saying this won't get off the ground, but ultimately it's a sequence of timed podcasts. It's not a broadcast radio station.
Right, but there's lots of opportunities to do audio differently, and I think it's a good timing for this. It won't solve all of their problems, but actually the interesting thing is why they're doing it is to attract new subscribers. So everything for them is about subscribers. So they want to hook them in with the audio. I don't think they're even going to have advertising. This is all about bringing people in for that long-term relationship. So I think newspaper companies are thinking completely differently with digital at the heart. I think the future of print is interesting. So I think we will still have print, but it'll be much more of a sort of niche. Maybe we'll luxuriate over the weekends, more sort of magazine-like. You've got Tortoise Media, if you know that, which is a sort of slow news operation. Digital first, but they produce these little books with all these essays.
How do they make money though? I find that baffling.
How does Tortoise Media make money? It's not making money, it's losing huge amounts of money. But the idea is, rich millionaires, James, venture capitalists. But the basic aim, their business models, our business models in journalism, are going to be very different, right? It was all based on advertising. Increasingly, print publications are moving towards subscription. And Tortoise is moving towards membership, Guardian with donation. But beyond that, it's things like events. So Tortoise is doing events every day pretty much, and either members or non-paying members will charge. That's their model in the future, and they're trying to build that model, which is a new model and nobody knows if it will work.
You know, the two things I would say about papers which are interesting. One is the Financial Times model, which was never took down a paywall completely and is a specialist publication. And I mean, their advertising, you know, their how to spend it supplements. They are in a good place, and they never, ever went without a paywall. They had a partial paywall. But the other thing I think, I'm still waiting for a newspaper to think, why don't you put out a proper equivalent to your print edition? One of the reasons I hate reading newspapers online is they never end. You know, I want to know, what is today's newspaper? And if they actually did that as a digital format, even the New York Times, if you have a subscription, you know, it never ends. I think that would be hugely appealing, because it's finite. And what ties people up partly with news is the sense that it's never ending. Yeah. You know, you never know where it starts.
So I think that there are many organisations that are doing that. I don't know if you get emails from organisations like the Skim or the Spoon, which is all about, you know, just give me 3 minutes, it's going to finish, and you will be briefed for the day. The Times has basically moved to an edition model where they don't update their website all the time. They basically do it 3 times a day. And it's about that sense of completeness. The Economist, of course, has always been based on that. You know, give me 3 hours and I will give you the world and you will finish it. You know, so I think this idea of the endless scroll is something that people are rebelling against. They want they want the sense of just, I've got this amount of time, brief me.
Well, they want a curated, edited paper, whether it's online or not.
They want both. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question, please, from Amit.
Yes. Hi, Samira.
This is your life for me. I'm seeing all some familiar faces.
Familiar faces.
I had a question for you on newspapers. What do you think about diversity on newspapers? And with your great experience, what's your advice to ethnic minority journalists working on national newspapers? What sort of stories should they be looking for?
It's a really good question. I can't speak with huge authority. I don't know all newspapers, but a couple of the ones I do, like the FT, I've been very impressed by some of the diversity of trainees they're bringing on. But everything, as I said earlier, is about how are they developed and do they stay or do they go? Again, I come back to the FT. I think it's very interesting that it's got, you know, a female editor. There's been a whole change in some of the stories. They broke the President's Club scandal, which was that city club where they were hiring very young women and they were being harassed by all these.
Which they put outside the paywall, by the way.
Yes, but I mean, it was the start of, I think, a big change to reflect some of the big social stories. The advice I always give to young people is, you know, if you have expertise, then you should use it. However, you need to be really wary of not allowing yourself to be typecast. And we know this has been a big problem with journalists who bring expertise from certain communities. Back in 1995, when I was a news correspondent, the first Bradford riots happened. And I remember pitching to the editors and saying, I think there's more of a story here about why all these young British Asian men are rioting, and I'd like to go up and find out what's going on. And I went and I actually did a piece which was looking at the sort of social inequalities, and it was, you know, it was much more nuanced. And it was funny because I got what we call a herogram. I got a letter from Tony Hall, who was then head of news, saying, Samira, this is terrific. It's exactly the kind of stories we should be covering, and I'm really proud that you did it for us. So in that sense, it worked for me. However, I do know other journalists who feel they were kind of stuck. You know, they would be turned to every time there was a story about the Asian community, but there was never any progress on getting out. And I've also had the experience with, and I think it's fair to say, it was Faisal Islam, who's now BBC economics editor. When he was at Channel 4 News, he came up to me one day. He said, Samira, there's this really outrageous story in the Evening Standard. And the headline was, Muslim taxi driver refuses blind dog. Be a guide dog. And it was like everything. It was a kind of classic. And he said, this is so Islamophobic. You know, of course, the story wasn't quite true. You should cover it, he said. And I just thought this was really interesting, the way that I was the person who, you know, stood up for some of these stories. And yet other Asian reporters wanted to keep their distance from them. And I think that's the dilemma, because as people get more status and more power, in a way, they've got power to stand up for these stories and say, this is part of modern Britain. This is not a minority story. This is about the whole country. So I think it's still a dilemma. But I do think it's important that people keep trying and I always say if you came from Northern Ireland during the Troubles and you had some expertise, you wouldn't be typecast as, oh, that person only does Northern Irish stories. And I think maybe people just need a bit more confidence to challenge and to pitch other stories too, so that they can avoid being typecast.
Okay, Samira has to go, so one more question to Samira before. Yeah.
I'll take two.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Listen from the ladies.
Hello, Samira. I have a question about how BBC is going to capture younger audiences, by which I mean kind of under 25. And we know from next research that loads of young people don't engage with news, one, because they feel it's not relevant to them. But in case of BBC, I really feel it's very much a question of voice and the way the BBC can, BBC often comes across as quite sort of uptight and, white men in suit kind of things. What are the plans, or where you see BBC going on social, on video, where is BBC ready to drop that tone, the kind of middle class educated people?
It's not just about tone. There's two things. One, when the BBC took BBC Three off air, a lot of people thought it was a huge mistake because it was telling young people, oh, we don't even think you watch television. And it did amazing things like that 90-second news bulletin at the start of every hour. And I think some of it is as simple as if you integrate straight news, always presented by young people, but with a straight BBC tone, into news, and Newsbeat has been doing it for decades on Radio 1, then actually you normalise proper news for young people. I don't think we need to patronise them. Bigger concern now is News Round, which is an amazing programme. There's serious talk about taking that much more off air and putting it online only. Whereas having those key bulletins at certain times of the day has always been a hugely important way in which you give news for young people. And I know it's aimed at children rather than young adults, but I think it's part of the problem is if you start taking away the places where young people encounter news in a straight way that's not patronising, then it's no surprise that they don't grow up with it. And the third thing I'd say is the news website, and you could probably say more, Nick, is they went through this big change about 6 years ago where there was a big concern that young people, especially young women, weren't reading it. And so you got this big change in stories to many more confessional, eye stories, stuff about beauty treatments and things. And there was a real dilemma, I think, for journalists about how far we're feeding this celebrity-obsessed aspect of youth culture, which just because it exists doesn't mean the BBC needs to jump on board, and how far actually we did need to rethink the way we tell stories. And I think on the whole, I respect the BBC's attempt to do it, but I sometimes worry that we think we have to youthify everything, when actually sometimes it's about allowing people to grow up, but also having integrated news where they are consuming it. And that's why I think taking BBC Three off air was a huge mistake.
So I just very briefly add, I do think that this idea of holding nerve is important. So when something really important happens like coronavirus, we do see young people turning to the BBC when there's election results. They go there first as well, and that's important. It may be that they're not going to go every day, but in terms of the precise, to your question specifically, it is about voice, it is about agenda, it is about different formats. It's about being open to putting content into different channels and really working out how to embrace people and engage people in those channels. The one thing I would say is that people in our research often say that they go to the BBC or news websites generally and they don't understand it because they don't have the context. So having more explanation or more personalised ways of just seeing a little bit more detail of what something means, because they're coming in to a story that is written for news junkies as opposed to people who just want to know what's going on. So I think there's lots of different things which news organisations are thinking very carefully about right now, about how to engage and when and how to do it.
Okay, so last question to Samira, please.
Hi, Samira. I'm a master's student at Goldsmiths. My name is Arushi. So I just wanted to ask you, you spoke about, being a voice for the oppressed and for the people who actually need it. But in India, like when we talk about the riots that are happening, a lot of like the newspapers or any, even NDTV or any of the broadcasting companies, there's like an indirect censorship of sorts on actually talking about the events that are going around. So as a journalist, if I'm working with an organization and they are putting a censorship on talking about the real events, then how do you go out and still report it? Or what are the ways that you can get around that?
I do not have the expertise. I can just say from here, it looks terrifying what's going on in India and the decline in, news journalism is always so respected, and there has been this long-term war, I think, on journalists there, and it really terrifies me. But Nick, you could probably say more.
Yeah, I think this is a worldwide trend we're seeing is politicians undermining journalists under attack. in countries like Mexico, for example. I mean, and this is, I mean, there's international organisations that document this stuff. It is getting worse, and it's often, in many cases, being fueled deliberately, by politicians, because they see journalists as part of the enemy. Essentially because they're asking them questions, and that is that is obviously fundamental. When you get to those issues.
We're going to discuss this more in detail. I think.
Did you have a question?
Yes,
Vijay Sorry.
First of all, thank you, Nick, for a very balanced and informative presentation. And regarding diversity, Samira, we regularly watch your program, and I really appreciated your presentation. I belong to a generation that came over 50 years ago here, and the only program BBC presented for the Asian audiences was this Naya Jeevan Nayi Zindagi, and we used to look forward to it. And we kind of started accepting this, that the Indians or the Asian subcontinent did not appear on BBC at all, especially on the TV. And anytime there was anything wrong or bad, it was mostly focused on the negative presentation of So the question is, have we made inroads, and are we there in terms of being inclusive of women, of all the different ethnic minorities in its presentation on the television? And are there a lot more people in the background that we don't see on the screen?
There's a few different issues in there. I mean, one is, I think, generationally, we're not in a situation now where Indians or people of Indian background should be regarded as, people who've come in and are separate. For my generation, we were born and raised British, and so programs, like Naya Zindagi Naya Jeevan, which was done for an immigrant generation, I think I can see the logic why they don't exist. I think there's still a huge row about the Asian network. Rightly or wrongly, I know some Asian journalists who feel it continues to normalise this idea that they're different, and yet equally, when I think of some of the great journalism that comes out of there, and also the cultural celebration, that it's like having there are radio networks which promote music which one might argue is of more black urban music, but I think it's a bit of a dilemma is how far you have kind of diversity represented by separate networks and separate outlets, and how far it should be more just part of how we do storytelling. But the biggest issue you've got is if you've got a half-hour bulletin on television at night, how many stories do you pack in? We're not even covering European news properly. I would say I've always felt that Indian stories got more coverage when we had the Gandhis, more prominent, and when it was Sonia Gandhi or Rajiv Gandhi. I just felt there was this old colonial connection to that generation, and so we'd still cover the Congress Party when they were very powerful. And now I feel, it's interesting, you've got some amazing BBC correspondents, and I really think in a way the fact that we have Indian-born correspondents covering India for the BBC internationally, as well as just in the UK, I think is a positive thing. I think the bigger issue is the competing amount of airtime. And in terms of diversity, I think what I said earlier still stands, which is, there's issues about who gets into positions of power. But but we can't give up. We just have to keep ploughing on. I mean, I'm still here after 30 years, and I still go on about it. But it isn't an easy solution. I mean, if it was an easy solution, we'd have had 50-50 parity on gender by now. We haven't had that. So I just think we just have to keep addressing it.
In decision-making, sharing with all communities when decisions are made at the top in BBC?
Well, I don't know what you mean by sharing with all communities when you're making decisions at the top. Editorial decisions have to be made at a high level. But I certainly think something like David Silito's initiative, where he went out to Bradford and they did a whole week of programming there, it's the kind of, maybe it seems like a gesture, but it's the kind of thing that the BBC is trying to do more of, where they do sort of strands or weeks of coverage, where they're going to, whether it's to a country or to a town, and they're trying to uncover some of the issues within it. They're doing one this week, aren't they, about echo chambers. Radio 5 Live, where they're going to very polarised parts of the UK. So I think there are all kinds of different strategies. There's no one answer.
Thank you.
I thought you were going to disagree with me.
No.
You better should. I better go.
I know you need to
No,
go.
sorry,
Thank
but
you.
thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much, and good
Thank
luck
you.
for the day.
It was fascinating.